Welcome back everyone to another reaction video, and as you can see on the screen, we're going to check out a little Mr. Beat today. I have not watched this video. In fact, I've not seen any of his videos. I've just seen the titles of all of his videos, and so I know that he kind of has a particular focus on, you know, politics and presidents and states, and so there's a lot of similar stuff in what his videos are about to mine. So I have no idea what his political biases are, whether he leans left, right, center, anything like that. But I thought it would be fun to dive into one of his videos, and so we're going to take a look at his video on what he thinks are the 10 worst American presidents. Now, let me say up front, anytime we get into this kind of video, I recognize there's going to be a lot of very strong feelings on this topic. And he may very well get into modern presidents, and if he does, I probably will tread lightly in my response to those, because I very much try to avoid modern politics on this channel. Not because I don't have it's not because I don't have feelings on those things. I have very strong political opinions. It's just that I don't want to alienate people on one side or the other when I feel that we have a lot more in common that brings us together in our love of history. So hopefully he's diving pretty far back and we'll be a little safer with that, but we'll see what happens. And I recognize up front that just as he certainly probably has biases, I have biases, so do you. Whether we recognize them or not, we all have biases, and as long as we can recognize them and acknowledge them, then we're okay. But let's go ahead and dive in.
I am Mr. Beat, and President's Day is over, so no longer are we going to be praising past presidents, but we are going to be talking trash about past presidents.
Somebody send Obama some life hacks on how to be a good president. Ha ha. Like, I bet that would help.
I give, and a lot of people, if you haven't seen these mean tweets, they're hilarious, and a lot of people have gone on and done the mean tweets. Anybody who's willing to go on and be self-depreciating like that, I have respect for them being willing to do that.
LOL.
Here is my video counting down the
10 worst presidents in American history.
According to my opinion, this is just my opinion, I'm a little biased, we all are, so
Absolutely.
Keep that in mind. I'm also aware that this may reveal some of my political beliefs, and that's fine. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it, as Philip DeFranco says. Number 10, Benjamin Harrison. Okay, he was all about really high tariffs, and you all know how I feel about tariffs, right? Right, I'm not a very big fan of tariffs. Bad job, Benjamin. Harrison was supportive of the overthrow of Queen Leokwilani and the taking of Hawaii, which is one of the shadiest parts of American history. Also, the Wounded Knee Massacre occurred under his watch, okay? Not only did Harrison approve, but the Army gave out medals of honor like they were candy afterward for a massacre. Number 9.
All right, so I would not have put Harrison in my top 10 worst presidents, but I can't disagree with any of his reasons why. I don't necessarily share the same strong opinions that he does on tariffs, but I'm not going to argue with his reasoning. I get it. This one I'm going to strongly disagree with, because this guy's in my top 2 worst presidents.
Andrew Johnson. Now, I wasn't going to put him on this list. I feel like a lot of historians talk a lot of trash about him unfairly, but, I'm all about character, right? And this guy was driven by his ego. This guy cared first and foremost only...
Wait, and can we all acknowledge that the man looks just like Tommy Lee Jones? Both Andrew Johnson and Alexander Hamilton, in some of the later paintings of him, Tommy Lee Jones.
About his own legacy and his own desires. He refused to compromise, and he seemed to dig in his heels when he faced opposition. Speaking of opposition, just as blatant opposition to civil rights for African Americans, as seen with his fighting the 14th and 15th Amendments and Civil Rights Act, I mean, that ended up holding back African Americans for generations. This makes him look exceptionally bad, and he was a white supremacist. But mostly, though, his stubbornness in politics. I mean, I know the radical Republicans that he opposed were also stubborn, but his refusal to compromise with them just made it look like he only cared about his own selfish desires and didn't care about the greater good of the country.
How can you not put that man higher than 9th? How are there 8 presidents who have been worse than Andrew Johnson? It's not there. The only thing I can think is that he's going to be throwing a bunch of modern presidents that are on the opposite side of the political spectrum from him in the top 5, which I know that happens a lot. And if you look at rankings, people tend to vote in recent memory. People tend to consider the people they voted for to be among the greatest presidents of all time and the people they voted against to be some of the worst presidents of all time. That's why we shouldn't rank presidents in the last even 30 years, because we really don't know what the long-term impact will be. But Johnson 9, no way he's anywhere worse than 2nd on the list.
Number 8, George W.
All right,
Bush.
now I know where he is politically.
Okay, obviously, I'm even more biased living through the presidency of George W. Bush, but I disagreed with his response to the 9/11 attacks in several ways. The AUMF, or the Authorization to Use Military Force Against Terrorists, basically give a blank check for the president to fight terrorism around the world. It's still in effect. The Patriot Act, which really was one of the worst laws ever passed in American history, really just stripped many civil liberties that Americans used to take for granted. The Iraq War, dragging out the Afghanistan War with no end in sight. Not a fan of all these things. His response to Hurricane Katrina. The Great Recession happened under his watch, and he responded to it with crony capitalism, which I'm not a big fan of. Bailing out banks and corporations, etc. No Child Left Behind. No teacher I know actually is a fan of No Child Left Behind. Not a good law. He expanded the surveillance state. The Department of Homeland Security, the TSA, all that. Detaining suspects without warrants who were never charged with any crime, never given any due process, just showed that he often made decisions out of fear, not out of reason. But such a nice guy, though. I love you, W. Sorry about this, if you're watching.
All right, so, and again, I'm not going to get into the modern politics. I don't like ranking presidents that are that recent. Whether he has good reasons or not for how he feels, I'm not going to get into it.
Number 7, Woodrow Wilson.
All right, Woodrow Wilson and Andrew Johnson are not in your top 6. All right. I don't know. What 6 presidents is he going to rank worse than Woodrow Wilson and Andrew Johnson? Anyway, let's go on.
First of all, Cipher from The Cynical Historian has definitely influenced my perception of Woodrow Wilson.
Wilson!
So a shout out to him. Go watch his 2 videos where he just completely bashes him.
And a lot of you have been asking me to talk about my reasons for why I think Woodrow Wilson was one of the worst presidents we've ever had. We'll do some videos on him at some point so I can kind of explain myself a little better.
Wilson was all about spreading democracy around the world, a very egocentric foreign policy. Sure, it said, hey, self-determination, right? But it assumed that Americans knew what was best for the entire world, and thus Wilson paved the way for future American interventionism. One big reason why he got elected in 1916 was because he said he kept the country out of World War I. What happens after he gets reelected? He gets the country involved in World War I.
And he was only elected in 1912 because the Republican Party split their vote between William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt. When Roosevelt ran against Taft, who was his handpicked successor, for the Republican nomination and didn't get it, he broke off and did a third-party run, which gave Wilson the votes he needed to win in 1912, and then he won re-election in 1916, as he mentioned. But yeah, Wilson has this messiah complex where he thinks he can be the savior of the world and bring, freedom to all these places, things like that.
Asking Congress to declare war, and they do. And during the war, the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, 2 of the worst laws in American history, urinating on the First Amendment. And Cipher pointed this out in one of his videos. I never knew this, but apparently he wanted the Sedition Act before the United States even entered World War I. And most of our presidents were racist, okay? We've got to consider historical relativism, but Wilson was exceptionally racist even for his time. The screening of The Birth of a Nation at the White House and then calling it historically accurate, not a very smart move by Wilson. Ignoring all the lynchings that were going on across the country when he was president. He ignored a lot of things, apparently, ignoring women's rights. They were marching across the country for the right to vote. He ignored them.
He did ignore them, but it was also during his administration that women got the right to vote, though that wasn't necessarily his doing. But Yeah, the Klan, which was pretty much eradicated under Grant as an effective national organization, sees its resurgence at this time. And it's not just anti-African American, it's anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and the Klan has incredible growth and strength that happens under Wilson. In Wilson's last 2 years as president, he really wasn't even functioning as president. His wife, Wilson had a stroke, a debilitating stroke at the end of his second term, and his wife basically kept everyone from him, and everything that went through him went through her, including the signing of bills where she would take it in and come back out. Here, he signed it, that kind of thing.
He ignored the first Red Scare going on, a lot of chaos around the country, didn't do anything about it. Number 6, William McKinley.
Okay, so William McKinley's worse than Woodrow Wilson and Andrew Johnson. So obvious political slant here. And like I said, I've got my own biases, but this is a definite anti-Republican bias he's got going on because the two Democrats that he's got in his list are two that pretty much I think I wouldn't say everybody, most people agree were two of the worst Democrat presidents. All the other ones are Republicans.
This one may surprise many of you because McKinley is consistently ranked in the top half of presidents, usually because the economy was good when he was president, and the U.S. was becoming a world superpower due to a more aggressive foreign policy. Well, guess what? This foreign policy sucked. McKinley's foreign policy was based on a Christian/American exceptionalism mentality that meant the U.S. was going to be spreading its influence around the world in places it shouldn't be.
Which is what every other major power in the world was doing at the time. I don't blame McKinley for keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak. I'm not excusing it, but it was the mindset of the time. It was that idea of imperialism, and if you don't do it, somebody else is going to.
The Spanish-American War, a war built on lies. McKinley, he struggled with the decision at first, but after talking to God said, yes, you should go to war with Spain, and so he went to Congress after that, and they declared war on Spain. The Philippines...
That said, you can't blame McKinley for the fact that Congress was willing to declare war on Spain. There were a lot of people to blame for that fiasco and putting that whole kind of show together to make us declare war on Spain.
American War that happened as a continuation of the Spanish-American War. That doesn't get much attention because it makes the United States look pretty bad, but McKinley justified that war. A war in which Americans killed civilians and rounded them up and put them into concentration camps.
Okay, so if we're going to use that argument, I'm assuming he's going to put FDR at the top of the list too, right? Because he did the same thing.
McKinley justified this because he thought the Filipinos were incapable of self-governing. He was the first to bypass Congress to send troops to fight in China during the Boxer Rebellion. As I said earlier, yes, the economy was doing well under McKinley's watch, but he had high tariffs. And again, I am not a fan of high tariffs. But mostly I'm a critic of McKinley due to his brash imperialism and his general disregard for the sovereignty of nations that just wanted to be left alone. Number 5, Richard Nixon. He was a pathological liar who mostly just cared about himself and his own legacy, not the general welfare of the country.
I'll say this, you cannot ignore Nixon's corruption. It's there, it's a part of his legacy, and it should be acknowledged. That said, again, out of 45 people that have been president, 46 presidents, 45 people, because Grover Cleveland gets counted twice. There's no way that Richard Nixon is one of the 5 worst people that have ever held that office. If you just look at the impact his presidency had on the nation and on the world, no way he's 5 worst.
Boy, did that backfire. I know there are a lot of obvious reasons to hate on Nixon. He was a crook. I mean, Watergate. His paranoia and backstabbing make it seem obvious why he's on this list and most people's lists. However, the war on drugs is probably the biggest mistake of Nixon. Nixon started the war on drugs, and we are still seeing the horrible effects of it. So that's why that tops my list of problems with Nixon.
And again, however you feel about the war on drugs, I feel like there have been policies far worse and damaging to the country than that. I'm not trying to downplay that. And honestly, I don't have a strong opinion either way on the whole war on drugs things. I know a lot of people do, and it's usually one of the first things that people throw out when I talk about presidents is that. And I know a lot of you have strong opinions on that. I just don't happen to be one of those people. Again, we all have biases. That just happens to be one of mine.
Nixon got elected promising to end the Vietnam War, but the war just dragged on during his presidency. Meanwhile, while secretly dropping bombs and cancer-causing chemicals on civilians in both Vietnam and Cambodia, he implemented wage and price controls, and this was horrible for the economy. A big reason why the horrible stagflation of the 70s occurred was because of his administration. Now, don't get me wrong, Nixon did a lot of good and was highly intelligent. Opening up relations with China,
Very intelligent.
his policy of détente with the Soviet Union, and the creation of the EPA
Yep.
are probably my favorite 3 accomplishments of Nixon, but he had such poor character. Had a booger sticking out. Number 4,
Republican.
Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, of course, makes many lists because of the Great Depression. It's actually a myth that Herbert Hoover did nothing in response to the early stages in what would become known as the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, for example, in 1929, raising import taxes, increasing income taxes to balance the budget, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to bail out businesses, and increased crony capitalism likely just made things worse. Under his watch, a recession became the Great Depression.
I don't know if I agree that Hoover bears responsibility for the Depression. I think that was inevitable. I could be wrong on that, but from everything I've read and studied on the whole situation, I think it was kind of inevitable by the time he took office. I'm not suggesting that he necessarily made the right decisions on how to deal with it. But again, wouldn't put him in my 5 worst.
His treatment of the World War I bonus Army veterans in D.C. was disgraceful.
That was bad.
Simply put, Hoover did try to end the Great Depression, but simply made it worse. FDR didn't have much success either after that, but at least FDR seemed to be more in touch with ordinary people. Hoover seemed very out of touch with most Americans.
And I agree with him on that. I don't think FDR's policies, which obviously were much more on the left side of things, made things any better either. And it was really World War II that got us out of the Depression. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to see who his next 3 are.
Number 3, Franklin Pierce.
Can't argue with that.
Oh, Pierce, where do I begin? I know. How about with the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Again, a law that was one of the worst laws passed in American history, and he signed it into law. A doughface. Sorry, that was a little harsh there, but
He's consistently ranked as one of the most attractive presidents in history. Let me know what you think about that. But that's what I always hear from people, is that Franklin Pierce is considered to be one of our more attractive presidents. On his way to take the inaugural to be sworn in as president, his only son was killed in a horrible train accident right in front of him, decapitated, I think, and he just kind of drank himself stupid during his administration. And he happens to be in that long string of one-term presidents right before up to the Civil War that kind of kicked the can down the road. Kansas-Nebraska Act was one more attempt at compromise to stave off Civil War, which by that point was kind of becoming inevitable. But yeah, Franklin Pierce consistently ranked as one of our worst. I wouldn't argue with that.
You know, a Northerner who was perfectly fine with slavery. The Ostend Manifesto. Pierce seemed to be okay with declaring war on Spain if it refused to sell Cuba to the United States. Pierce wanted Cuba annexed as a slave state. Boy, did that make Northerners happy. At a rocky time when the country needed unity, Pierce arguably helped further divide the country. Also, at a time when the country needed a more hands-on and active president, he was not. But you know who was worse? Number 2, James Buchanan.
Also
That's
won't
right,
argue.
Buchanan was worse.
Wouldn't put him in my top 2 because I've got Woodrow Wilson and Andrew Johnson there, but I'll acknowledge Buchanan, probably one of the 5 worst.
He took over as president after Pierce, and instead of learning from Pierce's mistakes, he just let the country become even more divided. Another case. You didn't have to bleep that out.
I think I know who his number 1's going to be.
Okay, Doughface. He was a president who did nothing. He didn't want to make anyone mad, but he also didn't want to make anyone happy. He was personally against slavery. He said it was morally wrong, and yet proceeded to speak out in favor for the Dred Scott decision, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in American history. In fact, he was so pro-South that he basically just let the South do whatever they wanted.
Which is interesting because Buchanan was from Pennsylvania.
When the states seceded after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, he blamed the Northerners and the abolitionists. By the time he was out of office, the United States was on the brink of civil war, and the Union had fallen apart, and he did absolutely nothing to stop it. And the worst president in American history, in my opinion, is Warren Harding. He once said, quote, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here."
You know, for a long, long time, we did not elect senators as president. It was very, very rare. People elected directly to the presidency from the Senate: Warren Harding, John F. Kennedy, Barack Obama, and I think that's about it. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if there's been another person elected directly from the Senate to the office of president. It's very, very rare. It never really happened. Again, Harding would be in my top 10, maybe even my top 5. Not sure he's my number 1, but I get it.
Here. I agree. He appointed many of his corrupt buddies to be in his cabinet. Some of them famously got in trouble for bribery in what became known as the Teapot Dome scandal. I know this sounds bad, but he was probably our dumbest president. He was not a deep thinker at all. He seemed to just let all of his corrupt buddies make all the decisions. He didn't stand for anything. You didn't know where he stood because he rarely stated where he stood on issues. He seemed to have no moral compass. While president, he would often cheat on his wife, and he had parties in the White House where they would illegally gamble.
Now, let's talk about while president cheating on your wife, because the list gets pretty long here. I mean, FDR did it, JFK did it, Warren Harding did it, pretty sure Grover Cleveland did it, and those are just the ones I'm thinking of off the top of my head. I am sure there are far more than that.
And smuggle in alcohol at the height of Prohibition. He didn't ever get much work done. He preferred socializing and partying to working. When he actually did work, he signed crappy laws. One law he actually did sign was the Emergency Quota Act, which was really a law designed to favor Western and Northern European immigrants and limit immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as most of the rest of the world. To sum it up, while Harding was a nice guy who was easy to get along with, he surrounded himself with shady characters and avoided any action whatsoever while in office. He was just a horrible president. And if you haven't noticed by this point, character means a lot to me in terms of how I view a president. Though there are, of course, exceptions like Harding, who I just mentioned, and George W. Bush. I love you, man, but you just made some really bad decisions while in office.
And, you know, a lot of people say that about Bush, regardless of how they felt about him as a president. There were a lot of people who said privately they liked him as a person. And that's true with a lot of politicians.
Well, that will do it. Those are my 10 least favorite presidents.
The 10 worst presidents, in my opinion.
Let me know in the comments below who you think was the worst president in American history. I'm sure you will agree with some of them. You might be surprised by others, though. A shout out to Buck Russell.
So I'll say this, and he acknowledged up front that he has biases, and I can respect that because we all do. So I'm not going to criticize him for being true to his biases. I'm just going to disagree with them. And obviously, he's probably on the opposite side of the political spectrum than I am, and that's fine. Have no problem with that. But just thinking about his top 10, the most recent Democrat on his list was James Buchanan. And that was pre-Civil War. So 170 years. None of the Democrats in the last 170 years made it into his top 10. But almost his entire list was made up of 20th century Republicans. So, I get that. that's part of who he is. And if you view presidents as having an impact one way or another on the country, and if you believe that those types of policies are bad for the country, then you're necessarily going to rank presidents in that way. So that's fine. I just have some disagreements with that, but I would love to hear your thoughts. Use the comment section below and let me know what you think about his list. We'll take a look at his top 10. I'll be curious to do that sometime as well. Some folks have been requesting that maybe I go back and redo my tier list of presidents, but instead of doing it as a stream, do it as a video where, without the interference and the interruptions of dealing with the chat, I can just kind of flesh out my ideas a little more and why I feel the way I do. So I'll probably do that at some point. Off to Vicksburg this week. Can't wait. Hope to see some of you guys down there. Thanks for watching.